Look, thank you very much to Stuart and for everyone coming out tonight. I'll open by just acknowledging the fact that we're meeting on stolen country. Always was, always will be Aboriginal land. Look, just to introduce myself, thanks to Stuart for that very nice bio. My name is Jim Casey. I'm a firefighter by trade, a union activist and general troublemaker by inclination. I'm currently an official with the FBU. I led the union for 7 years and I'm happily a part of the leadership team now as a Vice President. I'm a proud member of the Greens, a proud socialist, and I as Stuart ran against Anthony Albanese in the last election, which was an interesting experience, I must say. Yeah. And I'd like to particularly say hi to Georgia, because Georgia's a dear friend and comrade, and we work together at the FBU, so it's particularly nice to be on a platform with you tonight. So look, the topic of tonight was anti-union laws and laws to protect corporations, and sadly, given my skill set, I'm going to be basically speaking about anti-union laws, and hopefully between Georgia and everyone here in the discussion, we can get some of the other side of that coin engaged with. And I've got to say, I'm well aware of the weakness of the fact that I'm not going to be speaking about that, and I think it's often a weakness of the left that we focus upon the things which impact us specifically rather than talking about what the other side are doing to improve their position. But having said that, I'm going to proceed to exactly do that and talk about our side as opposed to theirs. My basic proposition tonight is that industrial relation laws always favour the employer, but the extent and the nature of that is historically contingent. And what is historically contingent about it is how strong we are. So the nature of how well our movement's organised, how the particular political currents inside it and how far they reach, these are the questions which determine the type of ILO we face. Every set of industrial relations law in a capitalist society will tend to favour the employer, but the extent and the nature of that comes down to where our movement is at, where our society is at. Right, so, it's actually quite, does that tilt? There we go. So, that's one major point. The second major point is this. While trade unionists have to, month in and month out, deal with the actual existing laws, there's still spaces inside that framework, however stacked the deck is, still spaces inside that framework where we can gain terrain, we can actually experience wins. And those spaces are often directly contrary to the intent of the people who made those laws, and we need to exploit them. But finally, the real point about the way IR laws are organised is the essential unfairness means that if we're not prepared to break them, if we're not prepared to see the opportunities to move beyond them, then it will be death by 1,000 cuts. These laws are designed to disenfranchise working people in their workplaces, and if we want to see some genuine sense of industrial democracy, some genuine sense of dignity at work, we have to be prepared when conditions are right to actually challenge these laws and proudly break them. So tonight I'm going to briefly talk about the federal system. Georgia is by far more experienced in that forum than I am, and I'll focus on the state, the New South Wales industrial relations system, because that's where I've spent my working life, both working and organising. But I'd like to start with a few words on law. And look, forgive me if this feels a little bit 101, but again, you got to play the cards you're dealt, and this is the hand I've brought tonight. So look, law itself, I think, is something we should explore before we start talking about the impact of union law. Look, personally speaking, I was raised in a progressive family. My father was a seafarer, my mother was a teacher. They were both trade unionists, not active trade unionists, but committed to trade unionism. My father was an Irish Republican, my family's all in Ireland, and my mother was a feminist. So I had strong progressive grounding. But as is often the case, there's those particular moments as you're growing up where things start to gel and you start to realise that things are connected. And one for me was a quote I came across when I was a teenager by a French writer, and those of you who are better educated than me will probably get the pronunciation right, but Anatole France, I don't know if I've pronounced that correctly. But the quote is an absolute corker. The law, in its majestic impartiality, forbids both rich and poor alike from sleeping under bridges, begging and stealing bread. Now, it's a wonderful quote, and it's one of those moments for me when I read that. I can remember just thinking, this isn't just a matter of the right side and the wrong side or just the way the world is. There's conscious effort going into maintaining the status quo. There are structures set up to convince us, because the key in that quote is the majestic impartiality, the understanding that there's an ideological formation around this, that people buy into the idea that law is above us, that law is actually fair, that law sits above and judges, when in fact what it really does is maintain the actual existing social relations. Now that is, I think, law is an entirety. And when you actually think about it, what's interesting to me about law is how, in spite of the way it impacts on people like us, most of the time law, it's about your person. It's about the way it affects you. But the vast bulk of the legal apparatus is dealing with commerce. It's dealing with commodities other than people, human beings. It's no accident that criminal barristers, while still on a pretty good wicket, earn a fraction of what commercial barristers do. And when you think about it, it's not surprising. The people owning homes up and down, Louisa Road in Birchgrove in my station area, we don't go to many fires down there. There's a bit of a thing about that actually. Poverty is what causes fires. So I'm in Balmain at the moment, Balmain Fire Station. And I've got to confess that while I had a bad night last night, generally we're not very busy because rich people make sure that their house is looked after. Poor people often don't have the choice or are using appliances. Anyway, I digress. It's not about firefighting and social relations. It's about law. So, look, law in our society is really about commodities. And human beings are a type of commodity, and we exist in law on that basis. But really, we're not that special. The one space where we are a bit special, actually, is the whole push, and this is a product of the social movements too, about human rights, about attributing particular legal protections or rights to individuals on the basis of their humanity. Now, that's a direct result of the social movements which fought over questions of gender and race and sexuality. Interestingly enough, though, I don't know if people have been following this, but in the US, the quite horrific shift towards allowing corporate personhood. So it's Supreme Court decisions running over the last 10, 15 years. The big one was Citizen United, I think in 2010, 2012. But that was basically which said that a corporation was a person, and a person had the right to give their money wherever they wanted politically, which meant that the Koch brothers could actually give billions of dollars to the far right in the same way that you or I could give $10 to Bernie Sanders. So, I mentioned that as my one mention of corporate law reform, where you can see they even take our limited wins in the spaces we create and contest them. But look, moving back to IR. Look, industrial relations law, I think, is exactly the same as all law in a late capitalist society. It's essentially, really, about defending the way things are. Now, when I first got involved in workplace organising, an old hand took me aside and said, you've got to understand, mate, the IRC is a boss's court. Now, that stood with me, and I've been saying that to people coming after me for years. And there's truth in that. And actually, you don't understand the way the thing is organised unless you accept that as your starting point. But it's not quite enough, I think, to really get to the guts of it. Because while it's true, the other thing you need to say is that they can't function without buy-in. If it was simply a boss's court, what you'd have is industrial relations like the 1840s, where the boss just did whatever they wanted. The reason why industrial courts can operate is because all parties feel at some level their interests are being represented. There's some form of compromise. Now, the compromise always comes down on their side of the fence, but the degree to which that compromise comes down on their side of the fence or closer towards the middle is purely and simply down to how well organised we are. So, the practice of IR law, I think, reflects this. I don't know how many people here have had, because it's kind of surreal actually. I didn't get any experience of actually being in an industrial court or in the Industrial Relations Commission until I became a union official, which is odd because it's one of those practices which affect hundreds of thousands of millions, but so few people get to do it. But the thing which is quite striking about the way industrial law is actually practiced, is that it actually has a far more robust and frank approach to it than the practice of law in civil suits or criminal suits. So rather than simply being a question of, what happened? Did you do it? Have you broken the law? It's quite stark. When you go down to Blythe Street, you'll have commissioners and used to have judges, commissioners saying, so okay, well, what's the issue and what's going to happen? How do we make this work? How do we actually knock heads together? How do we get a compromise which is going to be acceptable enough to all parties that this problem will go away? Now, I think all law at some level does that in a holistic sense, but the interesting thing about IR law is it actually does it specifically, and I'm sure there's lawyers in the room tonight, but what's always amazed me when I've spoken to friends of mine who practice law, unless they're industrial lawyers, when you talk about the way things happen in the Industrial Relations Commission, they're always surprised and a little bit shocked about how crude it is, about how people are just honestly saying, well, look, if this happens, there'll be a big problem, so let's try and do it this way, as opposed to the black letter interpretation of the law. Now, that's actually changing a little bit in this state, and I'll speak on that later. But it does speak to, I think, the social function of IR law, rather than being a kind of overall ideological umbrella which sort of convinces people about how things are, it's far more functional, or has been historically far more functional, about getting a result where you've got conflict. So, look briefly onto the federal system, and as I said, George is the expert, so, please grab me on what I get wrong on this, and anyone else here who's got any other insights should speak up. But look, potted history, kicks off at the start of last century. Important legislation, the Conciliation and Arbitration Act in 1904. That set up the award system, and you saw in rapid succession, over the 20 years after that, significant landmark decisions which were around questions like sick leave, holiday pay, minimum rates, all the kind of things which underpin the understanding of how work is paid, really, and lived in Australia, even today. Now, that setup didn't come out of nowhere. That wasn't the benevolence of, I couldn't even tell you who the Prime Minister was in 1904. It wasn't the benevolence of whoever the politicians were. It came out of the crippling strikes of the 1890s, where you saw these major confrontations between labour and capital, which were beaten. But elements, forward-thinking elements of the business community and the political community could see that this wasn't going away, that while they'd broken those strikes and they'd made an example of the leaders and people never worked again and there was all sorts of horror as a result of those defeats, the people weren't going to stop. So they started thinking about how do you respond to this. And look, the same thing happens in America in the 30s with the Wagner Act. The same thing happened in the UK about a decade after it happened in Australia. There's examples in every country where you've got a developed labour movement, how this kind of accommodation happens. In Australia, it was early, and in Australia it was actually a pretty good example of how you would start to see some kind of national consensus built around the idea that business needs to be able to actually make money, but we can't totally immiserate the working class, because if we do, one night they'll murder us in our beds. Now, it's controversial amongst both the left and the right. The hard left inside the labour movement, the nascent, well, it was too early for communism, but the early syndicalists, highly critical of this entire setup, saw it as class collaboration. And similarly, the more aggressive employers just regarded this as an outrageous imposition on their right to manage, their capacity to actually say, look, I'm the lord of my domain. But still, they managed to drag everyone together. As I said, the more forward-thinking, the Malcolm Turnbulls of the day, the representatives of the 0.1% who could see that they needed to actually make things work, managed to get that deal going, and it was, in many ways, very successful. There's a whole range of reasons for it. It wasn't simply the IR laws, but Australia was a bit of a model for how you would actually imagine a kind of humane capitalism in the early 20th century. So there were changes through the 20th century, of course there were. There was what happened in the World War years, the beginning of shifts around the understanding of women and work. But the most dramatic, I think, for the argument I'm trying to elaborate tonight about the balance of forces being determining the kind of nature of the scheme you've got, was what begins to happen in the 80s. So you see a political intervention from a Labor government in close collaboration with the union movement. It's funny, people always talk about Hawke and Keating as the great innovators. Really, the history is Hawke, Keating and Kelty, because if he hadn't actually brought the Labor movement in, none of this would have happened. So you see the Accord, you see a situation where a social contract is struck, where people, the union leaders, agree to essentially put down arms on the basis of a return in a social wage. Now, you can argue the toss about how successful that was. Certainly, there's things which came out of that which are eminently defendable, Medicare being, Medibank, the Medicare, being one. But the real problem with this was that you actually saw that high point, whether it was a good deal or not, it was a high point of the movement's capacity to strike a deal, followed by 15 years of constant and quite conscious demobilisation of the movement. Density plummets. You go from over half of the workforce being union members by 1970 towards early 90s, it's around about 25%. We're looking at 17% today. And it's not just the density which drops, it's also the quality of the movement that drops. So when they set the Accord up and you had this agreement between Labor and capital, the bureaucracy of Labor and the kind of, the internal, I don't know even how you describe it, the leadership council of capital, if such a thing exists, around the Accord, people who stepped outside of it were dealt with. I mean, punishment beatings were given to the BLF and the Pilots Federation for stepping outside of that space. And those who hadn't got onto the project saw what happened. So what you saw was a conscious demobilisation, and as a result, people stopped joining unions. And those who did join unions didn't have anything to do because the deals were done at the national level. There was no role for a workplace delegate or even for a local branch or even a state branch in some industries. which means that by the time you see John Howard returned, there's actually a real shift. Well, we've got enterprise bargaining in there, but I'm not going to go through that. So work choices is the end product of this. And of course they did that. If you were a Conservative politician representing, in essence, the Conservative national interest and the business national interest, why would you continue to deal with a Labor movement that was half its size and arguably a quarter of its strength? You wouldn't. Doesn't make sense. No one does anything in this situation out of some kind of altruism. They do it because they have to. And the movement was no longer capable of demanding, so even with the flawed, difficult terrain of the IR system up until that point, even that was too much. So we said we got work choices. The important thing to say, though, is what happens after that. Because when the Rudd and Gillard government finally came to power, we got the Fair Work Act. Now, the Fair Work Act is better than work choices, but it's not a patch on what used to happen. It still sets a whole stack of limits, and Georgia, yeah, thank you. Georgia can actually go through how this is lived. But the limits on the capacity of people to organise in a genuine sense, yeah, you've got the legal right to strike under the Fair Work Act. As long as you're not an essential industry, as long as you ballot your membership, as long as you give them heaps of notice and the courts don't knock it out. If you take action without that happening, it's crippling fines. Organisations get broken over a number of disputes. Unions like the MUA, you know, the amount of debt they're carrying is frightening because they refuse to be cowed on this. Well, actually, that's not true. The MUA has moderated their behaviour as well. They still take action, but they don't take it the way they used to because they can see the way their organisation will be fundamentally broken by this regime. Now, that was a Labor government that did that. And the reason they did that, I don't think is out of malice. I've not got my arguments with my comrades in the Labor Party, but I recognise that the vast bulk of them are quite sincere about wanting to see a better world for ordinary people. Maybe not the vast bulk, but certainly a significant minority. In fact, I'll give you a great story about that. We had a major strike in 2012, which I'll return to at the end of my presentation, but at the height of that, or the evening after it, we were having an emergency council about what we were going to do the next day. And my phone rings, and I answer, and it's Bill Shorten, the Minister for Workplace Relations. So Bill Shorten, I've never met the man, it's the only time I've spoken to him. He rings up to say, that was magnificent. You know, I couldn't possibly support legal industrial action, which was what you took, but it was magnificent to see you standing up to a Tory state government like that, and you will win. I took a lot of heart out of that, until I thought about the fact that the same man who's getting that warm inner glow is also one of the architects of a system of laws which is so much more difficult for people to operate under than the laws I was currently fighting under. Which says to me that Shorten's not a bad person. I think he's probably on the right side of the barricades. But he's dealing with actual existing social relations in which our side is not adequately strong enough to force him to start to deal up laws like the laws we used to have, which, while flawed, gave us more space to operate. Anyway, sorry, another digression.
No, great digression.
All good?
Yeah.
All right. Look, I'm almost done on the Fed stuff, but I just want to make one point. Earlier on, I referred to the fact that, in the most, or not the most tyrannical laws, the most tyrannical laws are terrible, but even in the most flawed kind of late capitalist IR systems, spaces are created and often unintentionally. And the example I was thinking of was how the traditional way IR was approached, it's still the case in New South Wales, is that while there was things you could do in court, you couldn't get there unless you were a registered organisation. So in New South Wales, we saw, for example, the paramedics break away, just incapable of doing anything at all because they weren't an officially recognised organisation. They spent years jumping through hoops to get that done, without buying into the split between them and the HSU. That was just the reality. The federal system, which is far weaker, which reflects a different mindset, a more individualistic mindset, which takes the organisations out of it, allows anyone to act for someone in the federal, inside Fair Work. And that's one of the ways that the Retail Workers and Fast Food Union, the union which is in Victoria real and trying to set up elsewhere to challenge the SDA in particular, has been so successful. Because they can actually appear and because they've got low-hanging fruit with these deals which are so bad they're below the minimum. So they simply turn up, find some members, challenge the deal, get everyone brought up to the minimum, which is better than their current wage. It's not a bad organising model. Not possible in New South Wales if you're working in the New South Wales public sector, which you're not. But my point being, a system which was designed to actually start to break down the space for official structures to have weight has allowed the opportunity for new ones to grow up. Look, state legislation, and this is more my bag. Look, it's changing too, and we're seeing change now quite rapidly, but there's still vestiges of a 1970s, for want of a better word, approach to IR. Up until 12 months ago, it recognised that IR players were trying to thrash out a deal. The kind of dynamic I was talking about earlier on, where rather than simply saying, have you broken the law or not, it was like, what's the dispute and what's going to happen if we don't sort it? So there was, in a sense, the game. And the flip side being, you couldn't play the game unless you're a registered organisation. You couldn't do that unless you were bureaucratically recognised. But still, for unions like my union, which is a member-driven, ultra-democratic, militant union, that worked okay. The changes since the O'Farrell government came to power, though, started to shift it. There was a speculation when they came into government they were going to hand over to the feds in the same way that Kennett did in Victoria in the 90s. So when Kennett came in, he inherited an IR system for his state employees, kind of similar to ours, shut it down overnight, handed them over to the federal government, and unions were wiped out overnight, like unions with 90% density, which relied on payroll deductions and had no organising base to sustain it, all of a sudden went down to 10% and were struggling to pay their rent. So that was what we expected. And so what we did in the FBU was we put on a stack of staff, and that was where I first met Georgia. We had break glass plans ready for how we deal with, the end of payroll deductions and a more aggressive IR space. And none of it happened. And it's interesting, with the benefit of hindsight, I think what the Liberals said was that we don't need to do that. We don't want to hand over responsibility to the feds. What we're going to do instead is start to change the IR system in New South Wales to make sure we control the purse strings. So what they did do was introduce policy which forbade the IRC from awarding pay rises beyond 2.5%, and more significantly, forbidding productivity-based bargaining. So the idea that you could sit down and say, look, we'll take on some extra work, we'll do this differently, we'll add this work on, but we expect to see compensation for it, out the window. The only way you could see a pay rise beyond 2.5% was if you demonstrated employee-related cost offsets. Now, this was a sea change in terms of the way union officials and bureaucrats had really worked on things for a couple of generations, which was between the big set piece battles, we'll find ways to squeeze a few bucks out here, a few bucks there, we'll take on some extra duties. It's a big one in firefighting, when we take on something like, actually the big example for us is medical work at the moment. They want us to take on some limited ambulance roles. And we're sort of saying, yeah, we're happy to do it, just pay us. And their response is, no, we own you, do as you're told. Massive change. So, that was the one big change. The other one now is a significant one, really. What they've done... Actually, I'm sorry, I've missed one point. I should always never miss a chance to talk up the FBU. And rightly so. Most wonderful union in the country as far as I'm concerned, but I recognise my bias. In terms of the way the O'Farrell laws affected the movement, there was no challenge to the I'll rephrase that. There was marches, but there was no concerted challenge to the 2.5% cap. And tragically, I actually think there was a real lack of understanding by large parts of the movement about the productivity issue. But there were two honourable exceptions. The FBU managed to extract a win that the IRC could still recognise productivity but not award the pay rises. We did that with a major dispute around community medical work in the country. And the other thing we managed to do was in 2014 deliver above 2.5% pay rises for the two largest ranks in the job through basically converting overtime being paid into a substantive pay rise. Now it's interesting, Justice Walton, who was heading up the commission at the time, was talking about this, and he gave lectures on this as an example of interest-based bargaining, of the way forward for the industrial relations world into the future, which I always found, like, on the one hand, quite flattering, because there were no other examples. No one else broke 2.5 that year. But also, in some ways, quite outrageous that you'd have someone with that kind of social weight saying this is the way forward. And failing to mention that the reason why we could even do that deal was because we had 100% density, we had enviable levels of compliance, and we were regarded as mad dogs who would bite you if you went too far. Interest-based bargaining, like all, I think, politics, is only a real exchange of positions and trying to find some kind of common ground if both sides are frightened of each other. And while we still enjoy a degree of weight and muscle inside my industry, the tragedy, I think, for working people in Australia is our side as a whole is losing that threat. So look, finally, in terms of what's going on, and I'll move on to a conclusion very shortly. In terms of New South Wales, the final thing which is changing, and I think this has been quite elegant actually, and I take my hat off to whatever strategist came up with it, the judicial functions of the New South Wales Industrial Relations Commission. the time when the industrial judges sat down and did the knocking of heads together I talked about. They've all been devolved back to the Supreme Court. And actually those individual judges have largely been retired, which means that now when disputes escalate, rather than having a practitioner who had really had their career through a time when the movement carried a bit of weight, we're now dealing with lawyers who are essentially approaching, or judges who are approaching this as simply a question of black letter law. Now what that means is that the highest financial sanction you can get under the New South Wales Act is $10,000. So if you ignore an order of the Commission, 10 grand, you do it again, they can talk about deregistration and so forth. But that's the line you dance. The PSA had a dispute recently where 500 disability support workers took 24 hours strike action. They talked about it for 10 days beforehand with notices going out. The Commission, or the Supreme Court made a decision 10 days out that they shouldn't do it, and they were fined for every day the notice was there. So rather than being a 10 grand fine, it was $88,000. Which is one of the reasons why when the RTBU took action the other week, it came out of nowhere and there was no warning, because that's been one day of action. Now my prediction here is that if they can't find a way to increase the 10 grand fine for the RBTU, they'll change the law to make sure it happens. So that's the way they're creeping through it. They're maintaining control over the sort of state-based legal infrastructure, but changing the rules in such a way as to be able to extract that more of a grip. And the reason they think they can do it is because they don't think we're going to stand up and fight. So I'm going to close by saying, while the laws back the boss, the extent is determined by how strong we are. And really, that strength is something which is both, well, developed through breaking those laws and gives examples of people why they should do so. So I just want to mention a couple of examples by way of a closure. The first is one close to my heart because I lived it, but the 2012 workers' comp strike by firefighters in New South Wales. It's an interesting dispute because it's sort of gone down the memory hole. It was the first general stoppage of firefighters in New South Wales in 56 years. It was the first time in 56 years no skeleton crews were left. Every fire engine in Sydney was brought into Macquarie Street. We surrounded the building, we hosed down the roof, we drowned out what was going on inside the chamber with the sirens, and the demand was basically that an exemption be granted for firefighters and paramedics for the workers' comp changes, or we'd be back the next day. 2 weeks earlier, we'd wanted this to be a union-wide push for all workers, but with no support, we went ourselves. Now we won that. The Shooters and Fishers and the Christian Democrats crossed the floor on the back of our dispute, and as a result, the best protected workers in Australia today are firefighters in New South Wales. And that's something which I feel inordinately proud of, both because of the win, but also because it was entirely illegal. From calling the first general mass meeting in at Belmore Street, through then marching, like taking over the street and marching up to Parliament House, calling in every fire engine around the around the city for another vote, physically hosing down. I mean, the TRG was on standby in Hyde Park, and it was only the police association officials saying, "You do this is really going to kick off," which stopped it being a more memorable riot, to be honest. We won. We won on the basis of being able to say, we don't care about your laws, this is too important, and we will break them. Now, we're not alone. I mean, it's close dear to my heart because I lived it, as I said, but really when you think about our history, it is littered with examples. We often talk about the BLF in Sydney, so I won't do that. What I will talk about is in some ways the bigger example, which, again, I don't hear much talked about anymore. The 69 strike, the Clary O'Shea strike. Clary O'Shea, he was a union official for the railways and trams. They had left leadership, they had fines accruing under the penal powers. The government attempted to basically get the money. Under direction, he said, "I'm not paying you." They locked him up. Biggest general strike in Australian history. 500,000 workers. Half of them were in Victoria, but the rest right around the country. Stopped work for 6 days. This wasn't like some pissant firefighter strike for 10 hours or even the memorable RTBU 24-hour number. 6 days they stopped work. And in the end, someone who claimed to have won Lotto in New South Wales paid the fines. It's a lovely story. And everyone went back to work, O'Shea was released, and those laws were never used again. Now that's a game changer. And that's exercising a situation where really the state and capital have to say we need to change the way we work because we can't do business without it. So I'm going to close really on that. I think that the tragedy at the moment is that we don't have a movement capable of actually, the time for artful politics and the right politics, I think, are when we have the muscle to actually then say, well, what does it look like? And there's been terrible mistakes made in our history about what it ends up looking like, and the Accord being the best example. But right here, right now, without the determination to fight, without the determination to choose the moments to break those laws, to illustrate you can win, we have to have a go. Without that being there, we're going to see more degradation of the existing laws. We're going to see a more anti-worker environment. But having said all of that, I look at what happened with the buses. I look what happens with my union. I look at those kind of, green shoots popping up where we're seeing Greenfield organising really successfully. The Retail and Fast Food Workers Union, I don't give up hope on this, but I do think we're at a critical juncture. At 17% density, we can't afford to go much lower before we really lose the capacity to act. So I'll close on that. I'm hoping that I can come back later and give you a better story. Thank you.